The valley of Elah was not silent. It was filled with the rhythmic, heavy clanking of metal against metal. Every step from the ridge sent a vibration through the dry earth. Goliath stood at the edge of the slope, a towering figure blocking the sun. He gripped a spear so heavy it seemed to bend the air around it. He did not wait for a response. He roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Across the ravine, the Israelite army stood frozen. King Saul stood at the front, his hands white as he gripped his weapon, but his feet remained rooted to the ground. Every soldier behind him retreated a single silent step, shields pressed against chests, trembling rhythmically. No one breathed, no one moved. The giant laughed, a low rumble that shook the loose stones from the ridge. He waited for a champion who would not come. A young man climbed the final rise of the camp, his shoulders strained by the weight of a heavy sack. David walked past the supply wagons, his eyes scanning the rows of men. He had come to deliver bread to his brothers, expecting the routine of camp life. Instead, he found a wall of men staring at the ground. He set the sack down on a flat rock and looked toward the ravine. The giant's voice boomed again, a rhythmic, taunting roar. David watched a veteran soldier flinch, his hand shaking as he gripped his spear. The boy stepped forward, weaving through the gaps in the line. He stopped beside a man who was leaning heavily against a wagon, his eyes wide and vacant. David grabbed the man's arm, pulling him upright. "Why are you standing here?" David asked. The soldier did not answer, only pointing toward the ridge. David turned his gaze to the giant. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David did not wait for their reply. He began walking toward the center of the camp. David pushed aside the heavy flap of the command tent. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of old leather and sweat. King Saul sat on a wooden stool, his head buried in his hands. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, and stared at the boy standing in the entrance. David did not wait for an invitation. He stepped into the center of the tent, his boots crunching on the dry dirt floor. "I will go and fight him," David said. Saul let out a sharp, cynical laugh. He looked at the boy's frame, then shook his head, gesturing toward the ridge where the giant still paced. "You are a boy," Saul muttered, turning away. David took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. He did not speak of destiny or glory. He spoke of the wilderness. "I have guarded my father's sheep," David said. "When a lion came, or a bear, I did not run. I grabbed it by the mane. I struck it down with my bare hands." He held up his calloused palms, the skin rough and scarred from years of labor. Saul stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and looked at the boy once more. He nodded, a single heavy motion of surrender to the inevitable. Saul gestured to his attendants. They brought forward a set of heavy gear, the metal dull and cold in the dim light of the tent. Saul insisted, his hands guiding the weight onto the boy's shoulders. The burden was immediate. David felt his spine compress, the sheer mass of the metal pulling him toward the dirt. He adjusted his stance, trying to find a center of gravity that no longer existed. He took one step, then another. The metal plates clattered against his knees with every movement, a jarring, metallic rhythm. He tried to lift his arm, but the weight pinned his shoulder down. He took a third step, and his foot caught on the edge of the tent floor. He stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward until he had to catch himself on a support pole. The metal groaned under the strain. He reached for the straps, his fingers working the buckles with speed. Piece by piece, the weight fell away, hitting the ground with a final thud. He stood upright, his frame light once more. He looked at Saul, then turned toward the exit, ready to face the ridge on his own terms. David walked away from the camp, his gait light and rhythmic. He descended the slope until the sounds of the army faded into a dull hum. Below, the creek bed was a jagged scar of dry earth and sun-bleached rock. He knelt, his knees pressing into the grit. The silence here was absolute, a stark contrast to the distant, rhythmic roaring of the giant that vibrated faintly through the ground. David began to sift through the debris. He pushed aside jagged shards and brittle clay, searching for something specific. His fingers brushed against a surface, smooth and cool. He pulled it out, turning it over in his palm. It was perfectly rounded. He tested its weight, feeling the density of the stone against his thumb. He set it aside and reached back into the earth. One by one, he found them. He held the fifth stone up to the light, inspecting its surface for any imperfection. Satisfied, he pulled his leather pouch from his side. He dropped the stones inside, cinched the leather cord tight, and stood up. He gripped the handle of his shepherd's sling, his focus locked on the path ahead. David stepped from the shadow of the ravine into the blinding glare of the open field. The ground was hard-packed, littered with the remnants of past skirmishes. He walked forward, his stride steady, eyes fixed on the ridge ahead. The giant stood waiting, a massive silhouette against the horizon. As David drew closer, the giant's head tilted. He looked down, his gaze sweeping the empty space where he expected a soldier to be. Then, a sound erupted from him, deep and grating. It was a laugh, hollow and mocking. The giant shifted his weight, the earth beneath his boots vibrating with the force of his movement. He raised his weapon, the tip slicing through the air with a low, predatory whistle. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" the giant bellowed. He took a step forward, then another, his pace accelerating. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of dust and impending violence. David did not flinch. He stopped, planted his feet firmly into the dry earth, and reached for his pouch. The giant did not stop his advance. David pulled one stone from the pouch. His fingers moved with practiced speed, seeding the rock into the center of the leather cradle. He began to swing. At first, the motion was slow, a wide arc that cut through the still air. Then, he increased the tempo. The leather hissed, a sharp, rhythmic sound that grew higher in pitch with every rotation. Goliath surged forward, his heavy boots slamming into the earth, sending tremors up through David's legs. The giant's shadow fell over him, but David did not look up. He felt the weight of the stone pulling against the leather, a perfect, balanced tension. He braced his lead foot, digging his heel into the dirt to counter the vibration of the charge. The sling blurred into a circle of motion above his head. The air whistled, a piercing, high-frequency scream that cut through the giant's roar. David's eyes narrowed, tracking the target through the spinning leather. He felt the exact moment of release. He snapped his wrist forward, the leather strap whipping through the air with a violent crack. The stone left the sling, a blurred streak of gray against the sun. It traveled in a flat, lethal trajectory. There was no sound of wind, only the sudden, sickening thud of impact as the stone struck the center of the giant's forehead. For a heartbeat, the giant stood perfectly still. The momentum of his charge died instantly, his body locking as if turned to stone. Then, his eyes rolled back, leaving only white in the sockets. He tipped forward, a massive weight losing its center. He hit the dirt with a sound like a falling tree, a dull, heavy thud that kicked up a cloud of choking dust. The earth shuddered under the impact. Across the ridge, the silence shattered. The Philistine soldiers, seeing their champion brought down by a single stone, broke rank. They turned, their formation dissolving into a panicked, screaming mass of bodies fleeing toward the horizon. David did not celebrate. He walked toward the fallen giant, his boots crunching over the dry, broken ground. He reached the body and stood over it. He gripped the hilt of the giant's own massive sword, pulling it from the sheath with a harsh, metallic rasp. He raised the blade, the weight of it pulling at his shoulders, and brought it down to end the threat once and for all. The silence of the valley did not last. From the ridge, the Israelite army erupted. Thousands of feet hammered the slope, a rhythmic, thunderous roar that grew louder with every step. They did not march, they surged, a tide of men pouring down the hillside to reclaim the ground they had feared only moments before. David stood still. He remained in the center of the clearing, the sling still gripped tightly in his right hand. The dust from the giant's fall hung thick in the air, coating his skin and stinging his eyes. but he did not move to wipe it away. He watched the soldiers descend. They slowed as they neared him, their faces shifting from terror to disbelief, then to a wild, frantic joy. They swarmed around him, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls, drowning out the last remnants of the battle. He felt the heat radiating from the ground and the press of the crowd closing in. He was no longer the boy who had brought bread to the front lines. He looked up at the ridge, then back at the path ahead, his breathing steady despite the chaos surrounding him. The weight of the sling felt different now, a heavy reminder of the path he had just begun. The soldiers reached out, their hands brushing his shoulders. The course of the nation had shifted, and the journey to the throne had begun.